Okay, here we go. Rig Kayak, Chapter 12. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Mrs. D'Angelo hadn't sent me that email the next day. Because I was on a downward spiral, no question, and that email changed everything. Brady, I'm sorry I didn't thank you earlier for the lasagna and the flowers. I appreciated it so much. It's been difficult, and I never even thanked you for what you did. It is so generous of you to offer to help. I do need someone to help with the yard. Would you like a summer job? Gina D'Angelo. It was never my intention to get a summer job out of Mrs. D'Angelo, but I went over on Saturday to talk about it. Mom dropped me off. She'd made some cranberry orange muffins that morning, so I brought a paper plate with 6 of them covered in plastic wrap. When I rang the doorbell and watched my mother drive off, I didn't even think about being on that porch a few days ago with the lasagna dinner. Instead, I stood there recalling the very first time we'd come as a family, the new neighbors, to the D'Angelos for dinner. This would have been during the holidays 5 months earlier because I remembered the porch banisters all decorated with pine boughs and an enormous, sweet-smelling bayberry wreath that hung on the front door. Dad hadn't been too keen on the dinner idea because, for starters, he's suspicious of all these rich new people moving onto the shore, buying up our farmland, rip-rapping the waterfront, and building their mansions with 3-car garages. Plus, he hates getting fancy. He'd kept muttering, I'm not even gonna know which darn fork to use. But Dad didn't have any trouble with his forks that night, and he had everybody hooked and laughing at his stories about the good old days. Mr. D'Angelo didn't believe Dad when he told him the underwater grasses were so thick when Dad was a boy that he once dragged a box spring through the creek to clear a channel for his boat. And Mrs. D'Angelo seemed delighted with all of us as she swung her head back and forth, talking to Mom and me across the table and tending to Ben, who sat beside her in his booster seat, smashing peas and potatoes in his face and making one heck of a mess. Mom was pretty that night, with her sparkly earrings and her long, sandy-colored hair twisted up on her head. We kept catching each other's eye, chuckling over the things that Ben said, such as, "This kewit is a torpedo, watch," as he made the vegetable plow a path through the gravy on his plate before targeting his mouth. After dessert, after I'd picked up every morsel of that delicious key lime pie with my fork tines, I said to Ben, "Hey, how about you show me the new hamster you got for Christmas?" "Oh, Ben, did you hear that? Brady wants to see Tiny Tim," Mrs. D'Angelo exclaimed. I could tell she was very appreciative. While she lifted Ben out of his booster seat, Mr. D'Angelo poured more wine for the adults, and I caught a grateful look from my parents as well. Ben's hamster was cute and had an incredible setup with a big cage and all kinds of connecting plastic tubes and hideouts. Plus, he had an exercise wheel and a glow ball that he could run inside. "You've got to be kidding me," I said when Ben explained how the glow ball rolled around on the floor. Fearless, Ben scooped up the hamster with one hand, plopped him inside that ball, and snapped the little door closed. And then he ran to the light switch and turned out the lights so he could sit cross-legged on Ben's bed that looked like a race car and watch the ball glow and roll around the bedroom floor. It was surreal. But I tell you, I about died laughing. I had time to think back on all this because it was taking Mrs. D'Angelo an age to answer the door. Suddenly, though, I heard footsteps and the sound of the lock being turned from the inside. "Brady," Mrs. D'Angelo said, opening the door. I hoped it wasn't rude the way I dropped my mouth, but I almost didn't recognize her. She looked so bad. Like a bedraggled ghost, you could say. Her skin was pale as chalk and her eyes puffy with big, dark bags underneath. Even her hair, usually so thick and curly, was pulled back severely, held at the nape of her neck with a cloth scrunchie like a lot of the girls wear at school. "Come on in," she said, stepping back. I brushed off my baseball cap as I entered. She smiled a little when she took the muffins, and since she was dressed in sweatpants and an oversized flannel shirt, I thought maybe we would go straight to the yard to start working. But she led me through the house to the kitchen. The D'Angelo's kitchen is twice the size of our living room, with its own fireplace and glass doors that open onto the patio. There's a spectacular view overlooking the creek. I glanced at it. You can't help it. But mostly I was keeping an eye on Mrs. D'Angelo, hoping she wouldn't get too sad or anything. "I do want to thank you," she said. I knew she didn't mean the muffins. "Oh, it was no trouble," I replied, immediately thinking how stupid that sounded. "I mean, that I did my best, Mrs. D'Angelo." "I'm sure you did, Brady." She sat and looked out the window. Unzipping my jacket, I sat down too, but it was awkward. I didn't feel as though I had said enough or the right thing, and you could feel her sorrow. It filled every molecule of air in that room, but man, I did not know what to say. Somehow we laid out a plan for me coming over to take care of the yard, and even though I told her I just wanted to help, she insisted on paying me, and I agreed. I agreed with everything because I didn't want to argue with her. That afternoon, I began work by cutting the lawn, which took me about 4 hours with their riding lawnmower. When I was finished, Mrs. D'Angelo fed me lunch, a sandwich, chips, and lemonade on her patio, and then she asked if I would take Ben's hamster. "Take him? You mean keep him?" I asked. She nodded quickly, and I could see her eyes filling up. "Sure. Oh, yeah, it's fine," I assured her, realizing how Tiny Tim must be a constant reminder of Ben. "I'll take him right now if you want." We strode silently, the two of us, through the house to Ben's room upstairs. The door was closed, and we stopped outside of it. "I can't go in, Brady, but here." And she thrust some money into my hands for food and things that he needs. I looked at the money, a thick wad of folded bills. "Please," she repeated, "I'll go get my car and I'll meet you out front, okay?" She turned and moved quickly down the stairs. I heard her clogs clomp across the marble foyer, and then the front door open and close. Only then did I stuff the money in my pocket and turn the doorknob to enter Ben's room. It was just as I remembered it from when I babysat several weeks ago. There were Legos all over the place, including parts of the castle that we had built. A wooden train was set up. The car bed was neatly made, with a stuffed dinosaur leaning against the pillow, which was in the shape of a tire. Pajamas were laid out on the bed, and a pair of fuzzy duck slippers sat waiting on the floor. I felt extremely sad being in that room. I could understand why Mrs. D'Angelo didn't want to go in. The hamster was beginning to smell too. Only then did I wonder what my mother was going to say when I walked in with a hamster. A rodent. At home, I set the hamster cage on a newspaper-covered card table in my room. Tilly was delighted to have Tiny Tim with us, and Mom didn't care, it turned out. "Just keep it clean," she warned, but the first night the hamster made so much noise running around in his wheel, I had to move him down to the basement. How could Ben stand all that racket, I wondered. As it was, I still had trouble sleeping. So that's going to be part 1 of Chapter 12. We're going to come back with the next video, part 2, Chapter 12.